The calculated encounter. Dominic Reed stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, watching Seattle's skyline glisten in the morning rain. At 35, he commanded Vertex Technologies, a corporation valued at $11 billion that he had built from nothing. The Seattle Business Journal had recently named him most ruthless CEO for the third consecutive year, a title he wore with unabashed pride. "Mr. Reed, your 9 o'clock is here," his assistant's voice announced through the intercom. Dominic straightened his custom Italian suit and allowed himself a slight smile. "Send her in." The door opened to reveal Fiona Winters, the spokesperson for Ecosphere Solutions. She was younger than he expected, perhaps early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical knot. Nothing about her suggested she represented the company that was now the biggest threat to Vertex's government contract bid. "Ms. Winters, welcome to Vertex." Dominic extended his hand, noting how she maintained eye contact without flinching, unusual for people meeting him for the first time. "Mr. Reed," her handshake was firm. "I confess I'm curious why Vertex Technologies would invite Ecosphere for a meeting when we're competing for the same contract." Direct, intelligent. Dominic could appreciate that, even in an adversary. "Please, call me Dominic, and may I call you Fiona?" He guided her to the sitting area where coffee waited. "I believe in keeping friends close and competition closer, but I'm actually proposing something different today." Fiona accepted the coffee but left it untouched. "I'm listening." "Ecosphere's water purification technology is impressive, revolutionary even." This wasn't flattery. Dominic had studied their patents extensively. "But your company lacks the infrastructure to scale it globally." "We're growing at our own pace," she replied, a defensive edge in her voice. "And Vertex could help accelerate that pace." Dominic leaned forward. "I'm proposing a partnership, not competition. Your innovation with our resources." Fiona's expression remained carefully neutral. Why would the notorious lone wolf of tech suddenly want a partner? Dominic chuckled. "Because I recognize exceptional talent when I see it, and because environmental sustainability is the future, something I've been slow to acknowledge." This was the lie that would open the door. His actual plan was simpler. Hire Fiona away from Ecosphere, extract information about their proprietary technology, then abandon the partnership and develop his own version. The government contract worth $500 million would be his. "I appreciate the interest," Fiona said carefully, "but I would need details about this partnership before bringing it to our founder." Professor Winters. Dominic had anticipated this. "Actually, I had something more immediate in mind. Vertex is creating a new sustainability division. I need someone to lead it, someone with your expertise and passion. The position comes with full creative control and resources beyond what Ecosphere could provide in a decade." He saw something flash in her eyes: interest, ambition, or perhaps suspicion. "You're offering me a job?" Fiona asked, her composure momentarily slipping. "I'm offering you an opportunity to bring your environmental vision to the global stage, with compensation to match, of course." Dominic named a figure that would be impossible for someone at her level to refuse. Fiona set down her untouched coffee. "This is unexpected. The best opportunities usually are. I don't make offers like this lightly. Ms. Winters, I've researched your work extensively." Another calculated truth. He had studied her professional background, finding it oddly sparse before Ecosphere. "Your presentations on sustainable water systems were brilliant." "You've seen my presentations. I make it my business to know who my competitors are." Dominic stood, signaling the meeting's end while leaving her wanting more. "Take the weekend to consider it. We'll have dinner Monday to discuss your decision." As he walked her to the elevator, Dominic felt the familiar thrill of a game well played. He had planted the seed. Now he needed only to nurture it until he could harvest what he needed. What he didn't anticipate was Fiona's parting words as she stepped into the elevator. "Mr. Reed," she said, finally meeting his gaze with something new in her eyes: determination. "Perhaps, don't mistake my consideration for naivety. If I accept your offer, it will be because I believe I can change Vertex from within." The elevator doors closed, leaving Dominic with an unfamiliar sensation. Doubt. He dismissed it quickly. Everyone had their price, their weakness. He just needed to find Fiona's. What he couldn't know was that Fiona Winters had returned to her modest apartment that evening, placed a secure call, and spoken 6 words that would eventually unravel everything. "Professor, I'm in." He suspects nothing. Veiled intentions. The sleek glass headquarters of Vertex Technologies hummed with speculation as Fiona Winters walked through the lobby on her first day. Employees whispered behind cupped hands. Dominic Reed never created positions for outsiders, especially not from competing companies. Something was happening, and everyone from interns to vice presidents wanted to know what the ruthless CEO was planning. Dominic waited in his office, reviewing the dossier his private investigator had compiled on Fiona. It was frustratingly incomplete. Her academic credentials were impeccable: environmental engineering from Stanford, followed by a master's in sustainable business. But there was a curious 3-year gap between her education and her appearance at Ecosphere Solutions. Nothing suspicious necessarily. But Dominic hadn't built his empire by ignoring inconsistencies. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Fiona entered wearing a simple emerald blazer over a white blouse, professional but unassuming. much like everything else about her public persona. Welcome to Vertex. Dominic gestured to a new office adjacent to his. Your sustainability division starts today. I'm surprised you've given me such prime real estate, Fiona remarked, noting the proximity to his own office. Most companies relegate environmental initiatives to basements or satellite buildings. Dominic smiled smoothly. This isn't most companies, and you aren't most hires. You're my ticket to destroying your former employer, he thought silently. The tour continued through the building's 30 floors of technological innovation. Dominic watched Fiona carefully, noting which laboratories captured her attention, which technologies made her linger. Her eyes were particularly drawn to their membrane fabrication lab, precisely where he would need to develop alternatives to Ecosphere's water filtration systems. Your team is being assembled now, Dominic explained over lunch in his private dining room. I've pulled talent from across the company, plus approved requisitions for specialists you want to bring in. Fiona raised an eyebrow. Generous. Most executives guard their personnel carefully. I believe in giving promising projects everything they need to succeed or fail quickly. Dominic leaned forward. Speaking of which, I'd like to see Ecosphere's technical specifications for comparison. Since you're no longer with them, I signed confidentiality agreements. Mr. Reed, Fiona replied evenly. Just as I did with Vertex this morning, I wouldn't violate either. Dominic nodded, secretly pleased. Her resistance meant the information would be more valuable when he eventually extracted it. Admirable. Though we'll need to understand what we're measuring ourselves against. We'll build something better without needing to copy. There was unexpected steel in her voice. That's why you hired me, isn't it? The afternoon passed in meetings and introductions. Dominic had carefully selected Fiona's team, all talented, all loyal to him, all instructed to report her activities directly back to him. By day's end, he had arranged for a private dinner at Altura, Seattle's most exclusive restaurant. To new beginnings, Dominic toasted, clinking his glass against hers. The restaurant's intimate lighting softened her features, revealing a beauty he hadn't fully appreciated before. To authentic new beginnings, she amended, holding his gaze a beat too long. Dominic found himself slightly off balance than usual for a man who calculated every interaction. Tell me about yourself, Fiona, beyond the resume. Not much to tell. She sipped her wine. I grew up with science all around me. My father was passionate about water conservation. A shadow crossed her face. He's not well. Early onset Parkinson's. It's why I'm so driven to make this work. Dominic hadn't expected genuine emotion in their game of corporate chess. It was ... inconvenient. And you? She asked, turning the spotlight. The business magazines paint you as a self-made wunderkind with the conscience of a shark. Dominic laughed. The media loves simplistic narratives. Poor boy from Oakland rises through sheer brilliance in cutthroat tactics. And that's not accurate. The Oakland part is he found himself sharing more than planned. My father cleaned office buildings, used to take me along sometimes. I'd see these executives with their corner offices, making decisions that affected thousands while my father emptied their trash. I decided I'd rather be the one making decisions. Fiona studied him, and the shark comparison. Business isn't charity, Fiona. I identified opportunities others missed and exploited them. That government contract Ecosphere's chasing, it's worth $500 million. I don't intend to lose it. Even if our solution is better for the communities who need clean water. Even if our solution is better for the communities who need clean water, Dominic shrugged. The best technology isn't always what wins. Connections, scale, marketing, those often matter more. That's surprisingly honest. She looked troubled. I'm always honest about my ambitions. This, at least, was true, which is why I'll tell you directly I expect the sustainability division to help secure that contract, by any means necessary, she challenged. By demonstrating Vertex's superior capability to deploy globally. He held her gaze. I know what you're thinking, and you're wrong. I didn't hire you to steal Ecosphere's technology. It wasn't entirely a lie. He wanted more than just their technology. He wanted to understand their entire approach so he could replicate and surpass it. As the evening concluded, Dominic found himself uncharacteristically reluctant to end their conversation. Something about Fiona's perspective challenged him in ways his yes men never did. Tomorrow we start planning in earnest, he said as his driver brought the car around. Fiona nodded. I'm ready. What Dominic didn't see was Fiona's late-night visit to Vertex's labs after most employees had left. Using her new security credentials, she carefully photographed certain equipment configurations, sending encrypted data to a secure server only she and one other person could access. In her modest apartment later that night, she opened her laptop to a secure connection. Progress report, came a familiar voice. He's exactly who we thought, Fiona replied. Brilliant but dangerously short-sighted. He's planning something with a contract. Be careful, warned the voiceholder, slightly tremulous. Dominic Reed didn't get where he is by being predictable. I know, Professor. Fiona's expression hardened, but neither did we. Asterisk unexpected revelations 3 weeks into Fiona's tenure at Vertex Technologies. Dominic found himself spending an unprecedented amount of time with the sustainability division. He told himself it was strategic, keeping close watch on his investment, but privately admitted there was something compelling about watching Fiona work. Her approach differed dramatically from his own. Where Dominic demanded results through fear and incentives, Fiona inspired through collaboration and purpose. Her team worked ridiculous hours, not because she required it, but because they believed in what they were building. It was unsettling. The prototype filtration system is ready for testing, Fiona announced during their morning briefing. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she'd been at the lab all night. We've achieved 98% purification with 40% less energy consumption than industry standard. Impressive, Dominic admitted, scanning the specifications. But Ecosphere's system claims 99% purification. A curious expression flickered across Fiona's face. We'll match it by next week. You seem confident. I understand the principles behind their technology. She hesitated. I studied similar approaches during my postgraduate work. Dominic made a mental note to dig deeper into her research history. The government representatives are visiting next Thursday. I want a working demonstration. We'll be ready. She gathered her papers, then paused. There's a community in Auckland Brookfield Village that's been dealing with contaminated groundwater for years. I'd like to propose installing our first pilot system there once it's perfected. Dominic stared at her. Auckland, why there? You mentioned you grew up there. Fiona's gaze was unwavering. Wouldn't it be meaningful to solve a problem in your own community? To show that Vertex can make tangible differences, not just profits? The suggestion burrowed under Dominic's skin. He'd left Auckland behind deliberately, methodically erasing all traces of the struggling teenager who'd once lived there. Now Fiona was proposing he return as some kind of corporate savior. We'll discuss potential pilot locations later. He dismissed, ignoring the disappointment that crossed her face. That evening, against his better judgment, Dominic found himself driving to Brookfield Village. The neighborhood had deteriorated since his youth, more abandoned storefronts, more chain-link fences around empty lots. He parked outside his old apartment building, now sporting a condemned notice. His phone chimed with a message from his head of security. Subject visited Professor Winters at Golden Pines Care Facility again tonight. Stayed 47 minutes. Dominic frowned. Fiona had mentioned her father's illness, but not that he was Professor James Winters, the reclusive founder of Ecosphere Solutions. This wasn't in her personnel file or the background check. Why hide such an obvious connection? The next morning, Dominic arrived early at Vertex to find Fiona already in the lab, working alongside engineers on the filtration system. You didn't mention your father founded Ecosphere, he said without preamble. Fiona's hands stilled on the equipment. The other engineers quickly found reasons to be elsewhere. Would you have hired me if I had? She countered, not denying it. You lied on your application. I wrote spokesperson for Ecosphere. That's true. I never claimed it was my only role. She straightened, facing him directly. Yes, James Winters is my father. His condition has advanced rapidly in the past year. The board pushed him out, claiming he was no longer competent to lead. So you came to Vertex to what? Industrial espionage. The accusation felt hollow even as he said it, knowing his own intentions had been far from pure. I came to Vertex because it's where I could make the biggest impact. Fiona's voice was steady. My father taught me that meaningful change happens at scale. You offered scale. Dominic studied her, reassessing everything. The board ousted your father, so you're using Vertex resources to improve his technology, then planning to take it back to Ecosphere. No. The single word carried unexpected weight. The current Ecosphere leadership doesn't share my father's vision. They're interested in quarterly profits, not solving the water crisis. Sound familiar? The barb hit its mark. Dominic circled her workstation, examining the prototype they'd built. It was elegant in its simplicity, more advanced than anything his team would have developed independently. Why Brookfield specifically? He asked, returning to her proposal from the previous day. Fiona hesitated. I did my research. When I learned where you grew up, I looked into Oakland's water issues. Brookfield has the highest contamination levels in the county. She met his gaze. But also, I thought it might matter to you personally. I was trying to find the human being behind the corporate facade. Something uncomfortable twisted in Dominic's chest. And what did you find? I'm still looking. Her honesty was disarming. But I see glimpses occasionally. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. The government contract committee had moved their site visit up to tomorrow. They had 24 hours to prepare. We need to accelerate the timeline, Dominic announced, already mentally shifting to crisis management. What happened next surprised him. Instead of panic, Fiona simply nodded and called her team together. Within minutes, she had reorganized their priorities, assigned critical tasks, and created a testing schedule that would run through the night. Dominic found himself working alongside them until midnight, ordering dinner for the team, rolling up his sleeves to help assemble components when another pair of hands was needed. It was the first time in years he'd been in the trenches rather than directing from above. At 2 a.m., with most of the team finally sent home to rest, Dominic found Fiona alone in the lab, making final adjustments to the control system. You should get some sleep, he said. setting a fresh coffee beside her workstation. So should you. She smiled tiredly, taking the coffee. The CEO doesn't usually mean midnight engineer. I started as an engineer before I became a CEO. It felt strange to remember that version of himself, passionate about creation rather than acquisition. You're good at this, you know, leading people. Different style than yours, she observed. Effective, though. He leaned against her workstation. Your father, how involved was he in developing the original technology? Fiona's expression softened. It was his life's work. He spent 30 years perfecting it, testing in drought-stricken regions across the world. She hesitated. There's something you should know about the ecosphere system. What's that? My father never patented the core technology. He wanted it to be open source, available to anyone who could use it to help people. Her eyes held his. The current board locked it down after he fell ill. That's what the government contract is really funding, exclusive rights to technology that was meant to be free. The revelation hit Dominic like a physical blow. His entire strategy to acquire proprietary technology through Fiona was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. What he'd been plotting to steal had originally been intended as a gift to humanity. Looking at the prototype they'd built together, superior even to ecospheres' current model, Dominic felt an unfamiliar emotion taking root. Not ambition or pride, but something closer to shame. Tomorrow, he said finally, after the demonstration, I'd like to meet your father. Surprise registered on Fiona's face. Why? Dominic wasn't entirely sure himself. Because I think I need to understand where all this began before I can decide where it should go next. What remained unspoken between them was the growing realization that somewhere between deception and discovery, something authentic had taken root, something neither had anticipated in their careful plans. The fracture. The government representatives were suitably impressed by Vertex's demonstration. Their water purification system performed flawlessly, transforming murky, contaminated samples into crystal clear water that exceeded safety standards. Dominic, standing confidently at the front of the presentation room, felt the contract was all but secured. The technology speaks for itself, he concluded smoothly. Vertex is prepared to deploy globally within 6 months. As the officials filed out, exchanging satisfied nods, Dominic caught Fiona's eye across the room. There was pride there in the work, in what they'd accomplished together, but something else too. Hesitation, worry. They loved it, he said as they walked back to his office. The contract is ours. And then what? Fiona asked quietly. Global deployment, just like I promised. Dominic loosened his tie, riding the high of impending success, starting with test sites in developing nations, then scaling rapidly. And Brookfield Village, she pressed. Dominic paused. That wasn't part of the original plan. Plans can change. There was an intensity in her voice he hadn't heard before. You said you wanted to meet my father. What? Professional curiosity. He deflected. No. Fiona stepped in front of him, blocking his path. I need the truth, Dominic. What's your endgame here? Because if it's just about winning the contract and boosting Vertex's stock price, I need to know. The corridor was empty, affording them a rare moment of privacy in the glass-walled headquarters. Dominic studied her face, no longer just a means to an end, but someone who had somehow slipped past his defenses. Let's go see your father, he said finally. Then we'll talk endgame. Golden Pine's care facility was upscale but unmistakably clinical. Dominic followed Fiona through hushed corridors to a sunlit room where Professor James Winters sat by the window. Despite his illness, his eyes were sharp, intelligent, instantly reminding Dominic of Fiona. You must be Red, the professor said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Come to see what you're trying to steal. Father, Fiona cautioned. It's all right, Dominic said, taking a seat opposite the older man. Your daughter has made me reconsider many things. Professor Winters, had she? The professor's skepticism was evident. Yet here you are, about to lock away technology that could help millions, all for profit. Dominic leaned forward. You built something remarkable. But idealism doesn't scale without resources. Is that what you tell yourself? The professor's gaze was uncomfortably perceptive. That the end justifies the means. Something about the old man's directness reminded Dominic of his own father. A man of few words but absolute moral clarity. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to consider what his father would think of the empire he'd built. The technology will help people regardless of who owns it, Dominic argued. At what cost? And who decides who receives it? The professor shook his head. My research was funded by public grants, meant for public benefit. The board's decision to privatize it was never my intention. Fiona watched the exchange silently, her expression unreadable. What would you do differently? Dominic asked, genuinely curious. Make it accessible, scalable but affordable. The professor gestured toward the window, where children played in a nearby park. Clean water shouldn't be a luxury. The visit lasted an hour, with the conversation shifting from technology to philosophy, from business ethics to personal legacy. By the time they left, Dominic felt strangely unsettled, as if foundations he'd long taken for granted had been subtly shifted in the car. Fiona finally broke her silence. You never answered my question. What's your endgame? Dominic looked out at the passing city, considering his words carefully. Originally, to acquire Ecosphere's technology, secure the contract, and eliminate a competitor. He turned to face her. I hired you to exploit your knowledge. I had you followed. I intended to use you. The truth hung between them, ugly but necessary. And now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Now I'm not certain. It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Working with you these past weeks has changed things. Not enough to reconsider your plans for the contract. Business doesn't run on good intentions, Fiona. Neither does redemption. She looked away. I should tell you something too. I came to Vertex to protect my father's legacy, to ensure his technology wasn't perverted for pure profit. I've been documenting everything, your methods, your intentions. Dominic felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. You were spying on me. While you were spying on me. Her smile was sad. We're quite the pair, aren't we? The car pulled up to her apartment building. Before she could exit, Dominic caught her wrist. Come to Oakland with me tomorrow. I want to show you something. Fiona hesitated, then nodded once before disappearing into the night. The next morning, they drove in silence to Brookfield Village. Dominic parked outside a dilapidated community center where children played with a rusty water pump that produced brownish liquid. This is where I grew up, he said as they watched from the car. That pump was broken half the time. We used to walk 2 miles to fill containers at a gas station when it was. Fiona said nothing, waiting. My father developed kidney disease when I was 15. The doctors suspected long-term exposure to contaminated water. Dominic's voice was matter-of-fact, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He couldn't afford proper treatment. He died before I finished college. I'm sorry, Fiona said softly. I built Vertex to never be powerless again, to never beg for what should be a basic right. He turned to her, but somewhere along the way, I became what I hated, someone who sees necessities as opportunities for profit. Before Fiona could respond, Dominic's phone rang. It was his CFO, calling with news he'd been anticipating. The government committee had unofficially confirmed Vertex would receive the contract. All that remained was the formal announcement. Congratulations, Fiona said flatly when he ended the call. You got what you wanted, did I? Dominic stared at the children by the water pump. Let's go back to Vertex. There's something I need to do. Upon their return, Dominic called an emergency board meeting. Fiona waited outside, unsure what was happening until his assistant emerged an hour later, face pale with shock, and ushered her in. The boardroom was in chaos, executives shouting, papers scattered across the table, Dominic standing calmly at the head. Tell them what you just told us, demanded the head of legal, gesturing angrily at Dominic. I've withdrawn from the government contract, Dominic stated evenly, meeting Fiona's stunned gaze, and I've proposed a new initiative, open sourcing our water purification technology and establishing a non-profit division to deploy it in underserved communities, starting with Brookfield Village. He's lost his mind, the CFO muttered. The stock will plummet. Possibly, Dominic acknowledged, but some things matter more than stock prices. Fiona felt the room spinning around her. This wasn't the calculated manipulator she'd been warned about, nor the ruthless CEO she'd come to know. This was someone new, or perhaps someone very old, rediscovered. Why? She managed to ask when they were finally alone. Dominic ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly tired. Because your father was right. Because I want to build something that would make my father proud. Because he stopped searching for words. Because, she prompted, because you made me remember who I wanted to be before I became obsessed with winning. His vulnerability was startling. The board is threatening to remove me. They might succeed. Fiona processed this, the magnitude of what he had done slowly sinking in. You're risking everything. Yes, his gaze was steady. The question is, was I right to? The answer that rose to her lips surprised even her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. Before she could speak, her phone chimed with an incoming message. She glanced down, then froze that it was from Ecosphere's board. Contract being offered to us instead. Need your evidence against Reed immediately. Sending legal team to your location. Dominic saw the change in her expression. What is it? Fiona looked up, torn between the evidence she'd gathered and the transformation she'd witnessed. They're coming for you, she whispered, and I helped load the gun. Redemption's path. The legal battle that followed became front-page news across the technology sector. Ecosphere Solutions, armed with evidence Fiona had gathered during her early days at Vertex, filed suit claiming corporate espionage and attempted theft of intellectual property. The government contract hung in limbo, while Vertex's stock plummeted 40% in a single day. What surprised everyone, the media, the industry, even Fiona herself, was Dominic's response. Rather than fight the allegations, he publicly acknowledged his initial intentions. I approached Fiona Winters with dishonest motives, he stated at a press conference, ignoring his lawyer's horrified expressions. I intended to exploit her knowledge for corporate gain. What I didn't anticipate was learning something far more valuable than any technology or contract, the importance of purpose beyond profit. Fiona watched the broadcast from her father's room at Golden Pines, her emotions a complicated tangle. The professor studied her face with knowing eyes. You care for him? he observed quietly. I don't know what I feel, she admitted. He lied to me, manipulated me, as you did to him. Her father's gentle reminder held no judgment. The question isn't who was wrong, you both were. The question is what happens next. What happened next was unexpected. Despite the board's efforts to remove him, Dominic retained enough shareholder support to remain CEO, though his authority was significantly diminished. His first act was to reach out to Professor Winters, inviting him to Vertex as a special consultant. The professor, with Fiona's cautious blessing, accepted. 3 months after the scandal broke, Fiona found herself back at Vertex, accompanying her father to a meeting with Dominic and representatives from both companies' boards. The tension in the room was palpable. Here's my proposal, Dominic began without preamble. Vertex and Ecosphere form a joint non-profit entity. Both companies contribute their water purification technologies to this entity, which will operate under an open-source model. Professor Winters will head the scientific advisory board. The room erupted in objections from both sides. Arguments about shareholder value, competitive advantage, and fiduciary responsibility flew across the table. Through it all, Dominic remained calm, waiting until the noise subsided. I've secured private funding to compensate both companies for the technology rights, he continued. Additionally, both Vertex and Ecosphere will receive tax benefits and positive PR from the arrangement. Most importantly, will actually help solve a critical global problem rather than just profiting from it. Professor Winters nodded and the government contract will be restructured as a deployment grant to the non-profit, Dominic explained. Lower profit margin, but wider impact and shared credit. The negotiations lasted weeks, with both boards reluctantly recognizing the potential in the unusual arrangement. Throughout the process, Dominic and Fiona maintained a careful professional distance, the personal trust between them still fragile and uncertain. It wasn't until the signing ceremony, with contracts finalized and champagne flowing, that they found a moment alone on the balcony of Vertex's headquarters. Your father looks well, Dominic observed, watching the professor chatting animatedly with scientists from both companies. The new treatment protocol is helping, Fiona acknowledged, having purpose again, even more so. Dominic nodded, then asked the question that had lingered between them for months. Do you regret it, coming to Vertex, getting involved in all this? Fiona considered this, watching the sunset paint Seattle's skyline in gold and crimson. I regret the deception, not the outcome. She turned to face him. What about you? I regret that it took me so long to see what really mattered. His gaze was direct, unflinching. I don't regret meeting you. The air between them shifted, possibility replacing caution. The first installation in Brookfield goes online next week, Fiona said, changing the subject to safer ground. Will you be there? I wouldn't miss it. A hint of his old confidence returned. I'm flying in my father's former co-workers, the men and women who cleaned those office buildings with him. They still live in the community. Fiona smiled, genuinely touched. That would mean a lot to him. It means a lot to me. Dominic hesitated, then added, I'd like you to meet them, if you're willing. The request held more significance than its simple words suggested, an introduction to his past, an invitation into a part of himself he rarely revealed. I'd be honored, she replied softly. 1 week later, they stood together in Oakland as clean water flowed from the new community purification system. Children laughed, filling bottles and splashing each other, while community elders wiped tears from weathered faces. Dominic, dressed not in his usual bespoke suit but in simple slacks and a button-down, looked transformed and diminished, but somehow more authentic. Your father would be proud, Fiona said quietly, standing beside him. I think he would, Dominic agreed, watching an elderly man who had once cleaned offices alongside his father filling a container with crystal clear water, not of what I built, but of what I'm trying to rebuild. In the months that followed, the joint non-profit deployed systems in 30 communities across 3 continents. Professor Winters' condition stabilized enough for him to travel to several installations, documenting the impact with the rigorous attention to data he had always valued. Vertex and Ecosphere, initially wary partners, found unexpected synergies beyond water technology. Dominic and Fiona's relationship evolved gradually, professional respect developing into friendship, and friendship deepening into something neither had anticipated when they first met as adversaries. Their shared vision created a bridge across the chasm of their earlier deceptions. 1 year after their first meeting, they stood together at another water installation, this one in a drought-stricken village in Ethiopia. As the system came online and villagers celebrated, an elderly woman approached Dominic, speaking rapidly in Amharic. The translator conveyed her message. She says you have good eyes now, eyes that see people, not profit. Dominic glanced at Fiona, who had been watching the exchange. Is she right? Getting there. Fiona replied with a smile that held both challenge and affection. We are both still learning. Later, as they walked through the village under a canopy of stars, Dominic took her hand, a gesture that felt both significant and natural. I built my first company because I wanted to win, he reflected. This feels different. Because it is, Fiona said simply. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about choosing what victory actually means. Beneath the African sky, Far from the glass towers and boardrooms where their story began, they found themselves at the beginning of something neither had been: a partnership based not on calculation or advantage, but on shared purpose and hard-won truth. The water flowed clean in Oakland and Ethiopia and dozens of places between, a tangible reminder that transformation was possible for communities, for companies, and for two people who had discovered that the greatest power wasn't found in wealth or cunning, but in the courage to change course when the path demanded it.